Hi there, we are Jim and Jonna Schuster, and this is a glimpse into our world.
Conversations from our living room, unscripted, without agenda, prompted by the Holy Spirit,
And usually over coffee.
about what God is saying to us right now.
No promises on what you'll get. Rev bombs, rants, breakthroughs, victories. It's all fair game.
But we hope it's a place of encountering the depths of the Lord together.
So come explore with us here on the Catholic Revival Ministries podcast. I was just thinking a little bit today, reflecting back over where God has been taking me for a while now. I felt really drawn to study the figure of Daniel in the Old Testament, but I feel like he has something really important for us today in our current situation, as culturally, he has something to teach us. But before I actually dive into Daniel, I want to look back and revisit the history of Israel leading up to Daniel. So Daniel's in the time of the exile, which is when the Jews were brought out of Israel by Babylon and kind of brought into captivity there. But I want to understand the events leading up to that. How did they end up in that position of being exiled, being brought out of their land? So I went into basically charting from Solomon all the way to the exile, from the time of the kings until then. And there's one thing that is kind of, as I've been reflecting about it, it's kind of jumped out at me as this theme of idolatry as one of the major things that landed them in that exile. And every time I've read the Old Testament, I always feel a little confused about idolatry. Because basically they're kind of carving gods out of wood or making them out of metal. And I'm like, how can you worship something that you created? I don't quite understand that. But then, okay, maybe I understand that from the perspective of the pagan nations who are just pursuing superstitions or things like that. But come on, Israel, you have the living God. You have Yahweh. You have a history with him. Yeah. And what can these idols offer you that you don't already have? Yeah. Which idol is going to be more powerful than the God who brought your entire nation through the Red Sea? Yeah. Rescued them from Egypt. And so I've just been kind of, instead of just being confused and going on oh, I don't really understand that, I'm just going to keep reading. I'm what is it about idolatry? What is it that lands Israel back there over and over again? And it's really rooted in losing track of God himself. It's fueled by a kind of desperation. It's fueled by turning to these other things in the hopes that they can provide something for you that you feel like you're lacking right now. Yeah. But again, we've seen what God can do as a provider. So really at the heart of it, it's losing confidence in God as a provider. Yeah. And starting this groping search of, well, maybe this will work. Maybe this will work. And sure, I'll try the gods of the nations surrounding me and just see if that works.
Wow. And that's not too different from, I would assume, the mindset of those pagans who are using superstition to try to control their circumstances. I think it's really easy to understand on the human level as well. When we feel out of control or powerless, out of desperation, we end up just doing whatever it takes. That's a very natural human response to that situation. And it almost puts on blinders to where God has come through in the past, because the fear that kicks in can be so powerful.
Yeah, exactly. So as I'm reflecting on this dynamic, kind of the Lord speaking to me and just showing me some of the areas where my own drive for solutions can pull me out of that confidence in God. And on some level, I'm just naturally geared that way. I'm a strategist. I'm always looking for, how do I get from point A to point B? Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but it's it's almost this heart test that tells me whether that is a legitimate, there's a difference between research, because you just need to get information to carry on your way. And there's a difference between that and groping for some kind of solution and some sense of control, maybe, kind of like you said. And I'm getting better these days at recognizing when my seeking answers is it just research, or is it fueled and driven by this sense of panic almost? Like, that's the telltale for me.
Yeah.
Panic says, I don't trust the way that things are going right now.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of in that desperate search for answers.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a tricky tension. We are responsible to steward the things that are in our possession, and that includes really important things like our health and our lives, other people's lives, the things that we own, all of that. And sometimes there isn't necessarily a clear user manual of how to do that. And so I think it can be tricky when the way forward isn't clear and things aren't maybe going according to how we might expect it to go. So their responsibility does demand that we do our research, that we are good stewards of what we have. So I find it interesting that you've identified that line of, this is where it crosses over from being a responsible steward into being, I don't know what you would call it, maybe borderline superstitious or borderline.
For me, it's kind of like, what am I missing? Is there some information? I'm very information driven. I'm a data collector. Is there some information out there that I don't have that's the key? And if I only had that, that's that superstition. If I only had this information, then I could get a handle on this. And I think that's part of the illusion, is that I'm meant to have a handle on everything, because otherwise, where does God factor in? And so for me, we've already talked about this, but like, I'm just reminded yet again of, there's that line from Paul where he says, you have many teachers, but you only have one Father. And, he's saying to the people he's writing to, I'm your father in faith. And what's the difference between a teacher and a father? A teacher might be able to give information, but a father gives identity. A father gives that reassurance.
You're doing well.
You're doing okay. You're on the right track. And when I start to get distant from the voice of God as my Father saying, hey, you're right where you need to be. You're right where I've designed you to be. You're in my will. I just heard on a podcast the other day that there's always enough time to do what God has called you to do. That God does not actually put on us more than we are capable of doing in 24 hours or the 18 hours that we're awake or whatever it is. And if there isn't time to do everything you're trying to do, then you're trying to do something that's not God's will.
Wow.
And that's a challenge to me. But it's also liberating, right? It's liberating to say, when I start to feel that sense of overwhelm, it's almost such a simple solution to say, okay, if I'm overwhelmed, then I'm outside of God's will, and he actually is making this a lot simpler for me than I'm making it for myself.
I feel like there's a depth to what you're talking about, but I feel like there's also, like, I want to poke into it a little bit, because without exploring it, it almost could sound like we're saying, oh, we need to just let go and let God and just trust in him and that sort of thing. And I think there's more to it than that. I think we're not supposed to deny the weight of what we're facing or what we're carrying. We're not supposed to just go naively into something without having done any research. And we're not supposed to deny whatever emotions are surfacing because of what we're going through. So what does it look like then to, if we're talking about in this context of idolatry, where we are putting more faith in an object than we are in the Lord, what is the object we're talking about here? Knowledge. We're putting more faith in knowledge, our own knowledge, than in the trustworthiness that even if I don't attain that knowledge, God won't let me go without, or he won't let me go unguided through this situation, or he won't let me go unprovided for, and that sort of thing. And so what does it look like then? So you named your red flag that you stepped over the line into, we'll just call it idolatry.
Sure.
Is that sense of panic that surfaces for you when you're looking for a solution, or you're looking for more information, and it becomes a sense of urgency. So when you identify that red flag, what do you do to pull out of it? How do you get your faith taken out of the idol and put back into the Lord?
It's a good question. Right now, the victory is even recognizing when it's happening.
Yeah.
I know what I've done over the last few days.
Yeah.
Which is kind of just pressing pause and almost letting those things that feel urgent, just letting them sit there.
Which is hard. You have to just let the urgent sit.
Yeah. And
does that strip the urgent of its power over you?
Yeah. I think that's a good way of describing it. That's what I've experienced over the past few days.
Yeah.
Where even just, the things that I had been neglecting because of a drive to get some other things done that felt urgent and whatever, simple things like my room not being in order, and the things that were sort of undealt with and that were clutter taking up space were constant visual reminders of the state of panic that I was embracing, of the state of like, I got to get more done. I got to keep going after things.
So in a sense, you really just confronted the sense of urgency head on and said, you don't get the power over me. You don't get to have the say in my decisions and my priorities right now.
Yeah.
I can look at you objectively and say, this might feel urgent, but it's not urgent. You know, this project that I want to complete, it's actually not as time sensitive as it feels. So I'm going to choose to remove the power that it has over my decisions by letting it sit there. And I'm going to vacuum the house. Yeah. And I'm going to cook some soup. And I'm going to do these things that have seemed like, oh, if only I had the luxury of time, I would do these, decluttering things and whatnot. But actually, in choosing those unimportant things, it reset the balance of what is important and what is not important right now, right?
Yeah. And even as you say that, it makes me think of my later reading as I've continued on into the book of Ezekiel. And he talks about the Israelites chose to serve these foreign gods, but then the nations that those gods belonged to turned around and dominated them, took over them. Whoa. And I feel like that's what happens with this sneaky sense of idolatry that sneaks in, is that if I, so to speak, bow to the God of urgency, then that idol will turn around and seek to dominate me. Oof. And so that power dynamic that you're talking about is like, the more I submit to it, the more it seeks to control and dominate me. Yeah. And so this process of coming back to God is really a process of being liberated and freed from the tyranny of these things.
Wow. Yeah. That's interesting. That's actually dovetailing with what I've been hearing from the Lord in prayer. I would say for the past few months, just this repeated message of get your eyes back on Jesus. And I would say over the last few months, I've had to do more fear facing than in a long time, just overcoming things that have been difficult for me, and kind of the do it afraid. Like I had to do a lot of things afraid. Yeah. And those moments where there's a lot of anxiety that kicks in and a lot of things that I'm looking for excuses to get out of it. And, I don't want to go forward. It wreaks havoc on my emotions. And then I start spiraling with my thoughts because I'm trying to balance out my emotions and get my peace back. And so I start trying to use logic to control how I'm feeling. And then suddenly my thoughts are kind of all over the place, and they're, it's just this, I'm looking everywhere, kind of like you said before, grasping at something that can fix the way that I'm experiencing life in that moment. And over and over and over, as I've pushed through and done hard things and overcome these fears, I afterwards find myself still looking for my footing again. Like, okay, I got through it, but I'm still feeling rattled. I'm still feeling like there's adrenaline. How do I stabilize again? And the Lord just keeps saying, get your eyes on me again. Yeah. Like, get your eyes off of the thing that you just overcame, off of the feelings that you're trying to dissect, off of the thoughts that you're trying to control, and just get them on me. And it's amazing. And he's not saying, pretend none of that happened. He's not saying, pretend that you're not feeling that stuff. He's just saying, just focus up here for a second, look at me, and I'm going to settle this. I'm going to remind you of reality. And for me, that's taken the form of worship. Like, that's like music-led worship is probably the fastest way to get my heart engaged on the level of intimacy with the Lord. And once I enter into that zone, it really doesn't take too long for peace to just kick in. And it's almost like I'd been operating on this lower level, and then God is saying, look up, and there's a reality up here that is so much more enjoyable and wonderful to live in, that just tune your awareness up here. And the other stuff doesn't cease to exist, but it's like that song, fix your eyes upon Jesus, and the things of the world will draw strangely dim. It's just, it puts things in its proper place. It gives the appropriate level of hierarchy to all the things that I'm trying to hold in that moment. And so that's been, at least for me, what the Lord's been saying to me, and how to keep these externals from ruling over me and turning around. Like, if I start serving them, they'll turn around and start dominating over me. Well, the way out of that vicious circle is to just look upward and get my attention on him. And then I'm no longer in that game. I've stopped playing the game.
I agree. And you were talking about the heart being so important in this. The heart of, what's going on in my heart, and knowing that, returning to the Lord, that anytime I come into the presence of God, it's like his number one priority is just to set our hearts at peace. He's like, hey, we can deal with all that. Like, we can talk about that, but first off, are you okay? Like, are you doing okay? Like, hey, let's just, and some of it is not even a question. Some of it's just like, hey, you're okay.
And that's going back to exactly what you were saying before. We have thousands of teachers at our disposal everywhere on the internet and books and everything, but we need fathers who are able to say to us, like, okay, I can teach you that skill later, but I want you to know that you're loved. You are good. Like, you're doing so well. You are nailing it at life. Like, you're going to be fine. And teachers aren't going to be there to say that, but fathers are going to be there to say that, whether those are earthly fathers or, in this case, our Heavenly Father, which we have access to all the time. And we can hear those reminders all the time.
Yeah, that's so good. And what a gift, like, just that it is so accessible. It is, he's with us all the time. There's an opportunity just to turn to him and say, hey, Lord, I lost my peace. Where'd it go?
He's like, I'm right here. Thanks for asking.
Yeah.